Hello everyone, today we talk about military logic. I promised you I would get to this point, and today we actually address exclusively what I use this thing for, mostly on my, Schwerpunkt, yes, but also broadly speaking as a historian. And it's not easy to explain, or better, it's really simple in its essence, and that's exactly what the problem is at the end of the day. I mean, the simplest things are very often the most difficult to understand, for a number of reasons, sometimes addressed these ones, right, and trying to, express this idea that fundamentally until you don't get to some point, you can't be aware of its existence in a way. I presume this is important for a YouTube audience that I see also by age being on average young, and exactly in that age that I presume without any specific secondary educational background in history and in military history has curiosity in popular culture relatively to warfare, to military aspects of different kind, and that would and I presume that follow my channel because they sense that they may get some of that information. And it's a burden because I didn't start Schwerpunkt to lecture people, and I definitely hope that you do not take me as a person that wants to convince you forcibly. I just put out things here that should be representative and exemplificative of that logic that we're talking about, so that they should work by themselves. Maybe sometimes I don't make it right. I don't know. You rarely tell me whether I'm clear or not, if you understand everything I say, or if there is something about my dialectic that is hard to follow, aside from the length of the videos, because not you, but other people out there say, oh, these videos are too long. Well, the idea is, if you go to university, and what do you say to your professors? That, the lesson is too long, if it's 1 hour, 2 hours, right? It doesn't work like that. An adult person should be training him or herself to get used to complexity, right? To difficulty, because brain is not just, you go to school, you finish, then you go to work, and it ends there. Right, there is an enormous unused part of our mind that maybe won't teach you how to solve your immediate problems, but I think on the long run it can actually work. But especially you do not know it's there until you develop it. I must confess, for example, when I started Schwerpunkt, I was in a state for which, couple of years, I was still at university. I had stopped it actually. I mean, aside from the PhD, I began it at the end, after my master, and it was a time in which I said, finally I can dedicate some time to things I'm more interested in, because during the university years, I didn't, I didn't have the time to read or to deepen my knowledge in all the things I was mostly interested in. I had those classes, I had to follow them to prepare for the exams. And albeit that was useful because it gave me a structure, at the same time, I feel like at the beginning of my 20s, I lost a great part of the time I could have formed to become a military historian, albeit, in a way I already was, because I always, for example, wrote my thesis about warfare. I had, a pretty, obsessive, continuity with, other reads here and there, right? Sometimes it's not even just about reading. We discussed this in other videos. It's really about applicating your mind, about finding out new stuff. And I say this because you will realize that even historians proper are not necessarily authoritative about certain topics if they haven't followed a specific path. Military logic goes along with fundamentally a rationalistic and anti-dogmatic mentality, right? The best military historians definitely come from that background. That's something that's a lot to ask for an average person, and even for an average historian. not all historians are people who are free of prejudice, that try to come closer to the truth, of course, without even presuming to get it. But fundamentally having a honest approach to topics. Having studied in humanities, I realized that, because first of all, I learned this warfare mostly on my own, right? Nobody taught me at university. And also in my colleagues, other historians, also some medievalists, but I had anthropologists, historians of religions, and so on, gave me the impression overall that the hyper specialistic and kind of very economical mentality that most of academic effort has seemingly acquired doesn't actually care much for the history properly meant, but it's just very picky and concentrated inquiry on certain aspects that can very often be also driven by ideological reasons that do not really have much to do with an unprejudiced mentality by start. I've met people who are doing it for political reasons, for other things that personally I never liked, and I always felt the need not to know what they were even doing, because I'm sure it's interesting at some level, because of course the more you research in a field, it's and the more you know, right? And indeed they are becoming experts in their own fields. But the problem is that the surrounding attention is basically taken out, right? The peripheral vision jumps, right? And that's a very dangerous thing for a historian, so that you can meet people who have studied their entire lives but not quite gotten much about very important things. For example, my professors do not know who von Clausewitz was. Now, I can imagine an average person in the world doesn't know who von Clausewitz is, and it's kind of statistically understandable. But I presume, a professor in the Western world that spent his own life studying this world, or even others, but still true, to our from our background, not knowing what von Clausewitz said, what was important, and why it should be so much understood, especially in our times, is something like you didn't even try, right? You didn't even try. Maybe you wanted to have a job, have a career, saying that you were a professor, but as far as the interest towards knowledge altogether, that doesn't come, right? Something that university taught me, but I presume because I got interested in it by myself, is that everything is interesting, right? There is not a single field of humanity that, because of your prejudices or your beliefs or whatever, you cannot study, right? A field of humanities meant even scientifically, everything, all what concerns human history is interesting, right? Those people who pretend that their country is more important than others, and that, they have just to talk about that they're worthless. They're not useful people. They're not Westerners. They're not historians. They're just garbage, right? This obsessive focusing on whatever it turns useful to you materially, it's pretty damn against any truly philosophical attitude. And military logic is a very harsh teacher, because it doesn't care absolutely anything what your opinions are. And I referred before to the young, mostly also male audience that YouTube at least statistically tells me you are, I understand it is hungry for a structure, for a hierarchy, for a method, for an order, right? That's what young men are technically designed by nature to do. And I don't see our higher education leaving a space for this, for these people to really do something with themselves and for the world with them. Military history is a great way to do it, because it really shows you, without any hypocrisy, without any ideologism, without any prejudice, that there is a universal message, that there is a real logic in the world, as a matter of fact, of which the military one, for example, is surely all one with a political and social one. Now we will explain it. I could make many examples of single passages, even single works that I've read, single phrases that I've heard from scholars, even of high caliber, let's say, that I was very dissatisfied with, because I understood that they came from formal learning, right? Those 2 or 3 things that you have to do mechanically as a historian, and they didn't even try to take a step further. Sometimes in history you have to be willing to dare, right? To possess a logic and a reason that can guide you, even when where the sources are missing in a way. That's the only way we can make history, because no history can be proven factually, right? Everything can be objectively interpreted. Even when you have a macroscopical evidence, there's still a lot maybe that you're missing about the context of that reality. And here we could even digress easily on all your cultural preconceptions, your bias, it broadly meant. These are all important topics in the philosophy of history, because we fail, right? At a distance of years, it happens when you read a book back in the day, maybe you didn't understand it, then you understood after a while, because you understood what's behind that. And that's also what the research is functional to, right? There is no shortcut. There is no easy way of doing it, right? That's why you need the history, right? Nobody can become expert. Just even assuming you've read everything that exists, bibliographically on a certain topic, that doesn't mean you're an expert. Even if you study for a long time a specific aspect of one thing, doesn't mean you actually know about what the whole thing is. And it's really a matter of perspective. When at the beginning you think it's like if I read all the sources, I will build myself that specific understanding. And surely it's a perhaps the only starting point. Ideally, right? Reading everything is not possible, but at least starting to think about new information you insert, and that's why as a young person you should be doing it. But fundamentally, there is a bit this idea that everything is easy, that everything has to come immediately, right? That you can even read a summary or that 5 minutes video on YouTube. But yeah, I know I'm the one who makes the 2 hours long, so I'm kind of making a bit of sponsor here. But really, you know what I mean. That when I talk that long, it's exactly because I want to make you understand the process, right? And I'm brutal because it's not good news, right? If you thought that it was possible, I'm sorry. That's not, right? But never think that the complexity of knowledge comes without faults, that just takes to be a historian, to have a bachelor, master, or a PhD to be actually competent on everything, or that simple tag on everything that person has written. You can say, that person said it, so we can go with it. That's possibly the worst mindset you can have, and there are specific parts of the West that actually are very much obsequious towards scholarship, not towards historiography, which is very disturbing, frankly. And I always tell you in this sense that there's two sides, right? Just know you have to work a lot, so you can measure by yourself that you're not the first one who starts that path. At a certain point you can get somewhere where nobody has been. Then you may be in relative terms the most competent person, but still, that's not even that by itself a valid. You should, if you think there is a moment which you can say stop. In terms of pure research, that is to say, okay, there is nothing more to know about this, just know you're wrong. And that you should question the reasons why you're thinking that. Of course, even when there are certain contexts where you say, well, the sources are just these ones, and maybe 2 or 3. think about ancient battles, as also we analyze in here. Yes, but as we will see, there is a context to those 2 or 3 sources, and this context is to be understood in ways that every person understands in a different way, right? There's not been historically a single text, a single evidence that a human being has understood in a way as the other, right? We all have different ideas, and that attrition, that conflict in a way of competition is fundamental also for fueling the research. From the other side, and don't become too anarchic about it as a method, always know that exactly for this reason, the authority is not always right. It just tends to be right? Because of course, if we were to inquire on an historical authority, we would talk with a PhD normally, with a professor. That's good and that's positive, because chances are statistically that those are going to tell a lot of interesting things. But never think that those minds are, coldly functional and know everything they say. Right? Some are very good because they're trained very intensely. Yet, at a point, you can understand what their human limits are and expand maybe on those. And it's very fascinating. At some point, we will make properly other videos about historiography, right, in the relation with it, because it has fascinated me a lot, especially when you start studying at university. You don't have much time for historiography. You just want to, the easy summary, the synthesis. That is also good, because that teaches you, I'm for starting from the basis, and that's how it's normally done. And formally, it's how more or less all universities work, except given the standard quality, what happens is that the students in first years are, pretending to learn the basis, and the professors are also very lenient, right? There is no worse professor than those who say, that you don't have to learn things by heart, or that a lot of work, or it's just a conceptual thing. No, it's not, right? It's both things, and it can't be otherwise. We could make even single examples. There are university lessons on YouTube. Sometimes we could even criticize them objectively, because it's not that I have an antipathy towards professors in general. On the contrary, but at the same time, if I were to tell the same story, I would use probably another narrative. And also, let's be honest about this: every history tells a story that must necessarily have a narrative, right? Having a narrative doesn't mean to have an agenda, right? And even having an agenda is not necessarily anti-historical. It depends on what is on that agenda, for that matter. History is also political, unfortunately, even when we do not want it to be. So when I say, that people are too ideologized sometimes about history, it is true, because they sometimes approach it from a dogmatic base. It doesn't help, but of course we are all ideologized in a way, right? It's the historical method that should heal you from that, right? I wanted to say something else, but I'll pass to the concept of military logic, because I've found out that, I often refer to it in my videos. And it happens in particular when I pronounce one of my definitive sentences towards this or that opinion different from mine, or when I have to explain why mine is superior, right? And which I hardly phrase in these terms, but I presume I do, right? I have a polemical verb of some kind, right? I try to leave it unpersonal, but objectively there is a lot of effort to push away certain, if anything, misconceptions or difficulties in understanding that we all have. I say, I don't know, the reconstruction of the battle by that dude is military logical, or military logic wants that and something, and I often don't explain, in fact, what I mean. I try to do it, right? And often it's more banal than it seems. You see, when I make the videos on von Clausewitz, it's largely we're talking about how to do that, right? How to explain why, right? It's a dialectical exercise, but of course an intellective one as well. Because from one side you see how the unnecessary, in fact, is such, and how we should address something that is actually war is really simple in itself, right? This is what most, I presume, have difficulty to state or even to think. War is very simple, right? It's how it takes place and its causes, its connections with politics, with societies. They are incredibly difficult to study, and that's why if you're not a historian properly, you tend to lack that. Everybody tends to give simple explanations for complex realities, right? But it doesn't mean that the essentials of a logic are difficult, because two complicated things at the end of the day are not very functional, right? And this is something that history, especially writing it, teaches you a lot, right? Sometimes you read something, you say, well, I could express this concept in a in a much plainer and more concise way, right? One thing is throwing examples here and there. These videos especially are a chat, but when you write down things, it's important to be concise. It's important to, I'm even too concise whenever I tell the truth. Or at least I like to leave a lot of room to the sources. I like to let them speak on their own, and I tend not to expose myself so much, but the synthesis is a bit the cream of what even the utility of that history should be, right? Making too many hypotheses, starting, fantasizing on that basis is usually, one hypothesis is good. If you just take the second step over that hypothesis, there is a boggy ground, right? And generally speaking, that's already useless in a way. But the logic we're using here derives from an intense study of lots of data. And like in the Clausewitzian method, we see that fundamentally the only way to understand warfare is to study the one that already exists. As we will see now, there are different types of military logic, right? Or better, 3 different meanings we can attach to it. There are both, all 3 of them are important. When I use the idea of this is military logical, this is illogical, whatever, whether I'm right or not, military logic is very often absent from the analysis of military historians. Yes, because also being a military historian doesn't mean to be actually competent in warfare. Being a military historian can be like you study what an army was in some time, and you just start studying its military administration, right? That doesn't necessarily mean you understand how that army actually worked on the field, for example. The history of the military art, so the change, the evolution of armies, of their equipment, their training, and so on, their tactics over time is really what we're talking about in here, and also what we properly distinguish in the artistical sense of warfare, right? That's also a distinction that very few historians know. I presume, I don't know, I don't know how many, honestly. But it seems to me that most historians, even military historians proper, have an eminently documentary mindset for their education, as it's right, but not a deductive one. I was just reading the other day, I will not throw names here and there, but I named it in one of my recent videos, a book that was studying an important list of battles that I even used as a model for my PhD, and that I expanded on, actually. And I read this the first time like 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even earlier. Then I came back on it when I had to make this work, just as a guideline. And I appreciated it. Even in my introduction of my thesis, I said, okay, well, this guy, was useful for me because at least he did something that I'd never seen being done. Specifically, this was also his PhD back in the day. So, I like to draw a parallelism. Now I'm concluding the PhD, and I'm looking at certain things that this person wrote, and I realized that the analysis, the tactical analysis of the battle, of the battles that he was analyzing, right, that are not the same ones I do, but there are some sources in common. Certain authors back in the 14th century that wrote about my battles, I like to call it them right now. and those battles that are treated here. And I was extremely disappointed. I realized that there was a lot of cherry picking. There was in there a narrative that, in fact, I didn't consider fair. That according to me didn't focus on the. It focused too much on certain details that, in terms of notary art, were fundamentally useless. They were a bit narrative, topoi, cliches, and things that could even be interesting, but a bit of color. They're not totally about the military logic involved in that things. And I think that, the work in itself was good, but still it could be much better, right? It could be excellent, and it wasn't. And theoretically, every professional should excel in his own field. The reason being that he was not making much of a history, but basically was telling a story, right? I confronted the method that I used to analyze my battles, that was literally picking all the single sources that talked about that battle, which is, I presume, what he did as well. But differently from him, I analyzed them for the reader to follow it, so that I wasn't cryptic about the content of these sources. I didn't, quote certain and others left alone. I always referred, for example, to every single passage. Even in note, I explicitated which words, which also in languages there should be translated. For example, either Latin or medieval vernacular from different languages, and especially focusing specifically on the tactical mechanics of the battle, which is also what the other guy should have done. And in my opinion, and I don't think to be a dramatically sophisticated historian, right? My tendency, as it is in my life, is that at some time I'm overly ambitious. I want to do, something, which I put a lot of energy, a bit like in Schwerpunkt, right? We just say, why do you do like almost 900 videos on YouTube? Well, what's your point? Well, I just like doing it, right? I don't even get money from it. I just like it. And the reason being that, and as I was saying at the beginning of the video, is that through this gigantic effort, and I can do the work well or not, right? And I'm not the person who should judge my own job in that regard. But which I repeat, I think it's above mediocre, but it's still not even there, who knows what. But I presume that's the only way to expand your mind, right? I realized that after these years, the things I learned from here, from the PhD, from everything, have had a dramatic impact on my mind compared to 3 years ago, just for example. And if I hadn't done that, I realized today that I would have been in serious trouble, because I could have done easily certain mistakes, right? So there is an easy way of doing things, like my father tells me how he, as a doctor, how things work now in health, in the health system. And the idea is that the doctors now, first of all, are told to do what does not put them in jail, right? So that defensive medicine, this is how it's called, right? First of all, do the things all by the book, and then curing, whether the patient dies or not. Well, surely you should do things by the book. In medicine, especially, not really easy, but at least medicine has that standard set of things you have to fix the single illnesses. Then, if a lot of things get blended together, there you really find whether the doctor is good or not. But technically, you have to make a balance, right? But technically, whether the patient survives or not, as long as you did everything by the book, you're legally safe. Doesn't matter if the patient dies, right? And this is happening everywhere. Why? Because of course, ever more, people try to. There are unfortunately cases of bad health systems, of negligent doctors and so on, like in every field, and that's serious because people die in that case. But don't think that an accountant can do the same mistakes or ruins a person's life in the same way. But society came to exploit that, right? A lot of people say, okay, let's, denounce this person, like sue him, just for the sake of doing it, right? It's more about, even in there, not the justice of it, not the health of it, but how much people can profit directly or indirectly from it, right? Like transforming health in a business for which it's managers that rule hospitals and not doctors, right? That's in a way, right? It's debatable at certain levels, but in a way there are lots of things that do not go well. And the thing I was saying before about medicine, about universities in general, hyper specialization, historians, and it finds the same parallelism with medicine, right? The idea is that back in the day, doctors had to be people with a mind that read through potentially everything. Now we have ever more sophisticated systems that need a certain education to be employed, that make ever more precise calculations, and basically the doctors are following them, aside from following the completion of their figures, right? So that we have a doctor that does just, orthopedy, another that does just, the nervous system, etc. But, if you ask one of the two to do their job, they do not even know where to start from. And I mean it literally. So this is happening also in history. And this is what I would like to, warn you from. Do not transform society in this, because if the moment society loses the capacity of synthesis, we're done for. Like, we are just machines that are operating on certain protocols and nothing else. Instead, the greatest gift of human mind, it's synthesis capability, and that's what we should be training all the time. Because every machine, if you set it in a certain way, can be analytical. The synthesis of the human mind is not there. In military history, in military logic, in the history of the art of warfare, proves it constantly. Von Clausewitz is the embodiment of this. He tells you, right, there is no way, there is never be any machine that will be able to sort out warfare. Any attempt is idiotic, because there is no way to simply calculate it. You just have to stay there and see what happens and try to make it. But it's such a complex system, pressured by such a strong amount of, at the strongest, human society possibly at the moment, it's such a narrow amount of time that there's no way to calculate it, no way, and there will never be. So history of warfare, in that sense, doesn't leave room for bullshit, right? And this is exactly what even the concept of discipline and logic and rationality, which also the military systems are based on, should be very helpfully, learned and understood by the civilian environment altogether, because it seems to me that most civilians are just, not caring, right? They have their office life, they start their work at that hour, and they stop, and then it ends, they quit, and nothing matters. It's just about spending their money somewhere else, having fun, or not thinking about anything. Yeah, fuck books, I don't need to learn, because, that's just useless, it doesn't produce wealth, doesn't it? If all people had a true and constant commitment to a specific social responsibility that passes through intellectual and improvement in terms especially of knowledge and rationality, we would all live in a much better world, right? And historians should give the example, because historians are objectively the only people who study basically everything at once. Right, history is not dates and names. History is studying the entire history of that is everything humans have ever done. Right, so much we have a history of everything. We have a history of medicine. We have a history of economics. Everybody has its own, and as we've seen, history of warfare is very peculiar in its own kind, very unique, almost distinguished, perhaps by all the other types of histories for its peculiar. Iron logic, that is the one we should be searching for now, and that require fundamentally this capacity of synthesis, for which it's not that as a historian you can be, as a historian of medicine you're not a doctor, right? Historian of technology, you're not an engineer or whatever, but you're more than that in the sense, at least, in the methodological sense of the term, because you're obliged to start telling that story not from that set of proportions, for building a house. That, if you're an architect, you have, and it's those measures, and so on, and someone prepares it for you. You just have to learn and know how to applicate them. No, you take that thing out of any other context, and you have to start telling the story without any base. And the problem is that if you don't explain this story well, you are criticized. I mean, you're under review. You're constantly, you can't be eaten alive, literally, and you're constantly immersed into that, right? And I don't consider wise or even deontologically correct for a historian to say, well, now I will simply, if archaeologists tell me something, I should just trust the archaeologist. Or if the anthropologists tell me something else, I have just trust the anthropologist. Historians have this unique standpoint for which they get the information that these other specialists are surely the best in their own field, but that they, by work, they do not frame into a broader perspective, right? Because if you haven't studied history of warfare objectively, you can't even, and I speak for military historians even here specifically, compared to other historians, you can't say that if you studied politics, otherwise you know the thing. Because if you haven't studied warfare, you do not know politics. You do not know society. It's impossible, right? It's like cutting a human being in three parts and taking off one and saying let it work. It cannot. And we have explained many times in the Krieg what we mean by warfare. That this is not like the allegedly conventional. There is no conventional warfare, by the way. But what you may hear of that specific war fought from that day to that day. That's just its formality. Here we're talking about a hybrid situation of conflict that erupts, it breaks out into open warfare here and there by simple use of violence, right? Even a spy blowing someone's head is making war, specifically in the violence of it. But just even a rioter that throws a rock against a police officer, that's war, right? And it's not a dialectical exaggeration. I mean, in Clausewitzian terms, it is asymptotically, universalistically, properly what that thing is, right? And do not make too many formalities, take away from your mindset, for example, concepts like geopolitics, like the idea that, warfare is something that, after all, we shouldn't be doing, or that happens just in the case of certain specific, cultural characteristics. None of this. Warfare is a universal language that we all play in our own lives every day, right? And the boundary which is not traceable, specifically. And that's why it permeates everything, and you cannot exclude it. As much as you cannot exclude politics that fundamentally enacts it, right, just as an instrument for which it's not even, a primitive force on its own that, wages unrestrained for no specific reason or for someone's craziness. If anything, it's most of the time the contrary, because politics is, and even if you don't believe about it, because maybe you're a populist, but, it's, at least in relative terms, the most rational element of society, for reasons that we do not explain. But that logic, and that reflects into society altogether, and that this is at least understandable, and it's that logic that we're talking about, broadly meant. Then, more specifically, talking about warfare, there is, as we have explained, a logic now we will define better. The other mistake that often historians do, when they do not have any specific military skill still in the historical sense, but on the study of warfare, that even here, gnoseologically speaking, is the same between a military man and a historian. Actually, we have come to a point into history which the good military historians know military history on average better than the military man, right? Never think that being a military man actually, or having participated or being even just as a civilian into a war, actually has anything to do with understanding what warfare is. Also, that crosses it completely out from your mind. It's a very serious endeavor that commits, enormous intellectual efforts, which is normally what most people, nor in the civilian nor in the military environment, actually do, right? Fighting in a war has nothing understanding with why it's being fought, having an idea of the bigger picture. That's simply why we have a hierarchy, why we have an elite, why this thing that what there is this serious need for, in fact, a control from the above, because just specifically qualified minds are in charge of what is happening. And even if they make mistakes, it's not because the people in the lower ranks would do better most of the times. So from a gnosiological point of view, whether you're a militaryman or a civilian, you basically study warfare, right? Just the main difference is that you have direct experience of, at least of command, because that's mostly of combat. It's really about leading that combat that makes the difference, right? And that is the most important element, let's say, for understanding warfare, as von Clausewitz points out. But even he who does that doesn't necessarily have an idea of what actually happened in a battle. We know it at so many levels. At this point, we really don't have to explain it, at least not now. The military historian has it somewhat easier, especially after years and years those military events happened. There have already been inquiries, but at the end of the day, there is no difference with the properly historical, the philosophically speaking, the concept that you have to reconstruct, to research, to carry out an inquiry, to understand what happened on the basis of evidence, right? And studying military history for years and years does bring also to those who have never commanded a man in their own lives. I just commanded my squad once, for the military academy, and the march around the perimeter of the internal quarters. That's it. That's my only experience of command. But I can tell you that, of course, studying military history is fundamentally a much. It's one of those experiences that you objectively cannot understand how much you can learn from until you do it, right? It's impressive. It shocks you. It slaps you, right? It's not even a pleasant experience altogether. It's beautiful, but it's terrifying at the same time. Also because you realize fundamentally also what warfare is about, right? Not what really is, because at that point a person that has been under the bombings or seen a person, slaughtered in front of it gets definitely a much better, emotional impact of what that concretizes like, but that's still not military logic. Military logic is developed, as we were saying, through the reconstruction of these military events, right? And if you're not used to that, that means you're a simple historian that, let's assume, like I see many times, a medievalist that is an excellent medievalist, that has always studied, politics, institutions, law, those things. Maybe he has also very good, as a culture person, know what that battle has been about, know the deeper meaning of it. But you can easily spot that if they've never carried out a military, logical analysis, let's call it this way, of a battle, if they've never wrapped their minds around what it means to reconstruct how two armies worked on the field to destroy one another, there's no way to avoid serious errors of military logic. Not always perhaps, but still there is a lack of depth, a lack of perspective that you can have only in the measure in which you have repeatedly studied battle after battle and understood in there. Comparative analysis is of dramatic importance, right? Reasoning by analogies is also another very precious but very dangerous way of making history in general, but it's still a thing. But comparing, broader the horizon, that's why I often take position against hyper-specialization, not just for the what we said above, but concretely because you lack terms of comparison otherwise. You can know everything about a single battle, but if you haven't studied much others, you cannot. I can tell you, for example, in my master's thesis, as I said many times, it was all about one battle. I wrote 260 pages about it. I've been on the battlefield. It's been like a spiritual journey to me. It's another thing I should tell you at some point. We'll talk about the battle, and because that also was unique, and I discovered that other military historians had similar emotional experience when that happened, but it's also a very, very peculiar kind. Um, I I had Stendhal syndrome a little bit, here and there, but that was something different. That was something else. That is even realizing that there is a landscape that speaks, right? That tells you, look, the thing went like this because the ground is a protagonist in the thing, and until you know how many times I looked at the photos of that battlefield before during that year, how much I looked at from Google Maps, all the possible visions in tridimensional way, until I wasn't there, I could not understand, right? I could not understand, but even more, right? Even having spent all that time studying that single battle, then I studied many others, and I realized that when I wrote that thing, I didn't have an idea that. Given that, because that was a single battle with certain specific sources that said certain things but didn't say others, that actually there were other options opened, right? And not just, in the mechanism proper of combat, but also in the context broadly meant. And I will talk more specifically about this. We will get to the point, right? So speaking of military logic, well, this has three distinct yet linked meanings. The first refers to the development of doctrine, that is, the transition from theories to doctrines. The second, to the elaboration and management of operations. The third, to the analysis of military events. And this is what I usually refer to in my videos, right? Because that's what we do. I mean, we mostly make analysis of battles, mostly, right? Or either military systems, but those require mostly a political and social, composition altogether. So it's not strictly military, but mostly in the battles playlist you can check out. We fundamentally do that, and there is, even in there, however, an important attention, as we will see now, to politics and society, just as much as there is war. Also, never commit the mistake, because you see, the new military history has brought on the fore since the 80s or so this idea, this thing of rethinking military history, as if by the 21st century, rethinking, people that start having impressions about rethinking military history, you think, what can bring to, right? After von Clausewitz wrote his masterpiece, the only thing you should be doing is coming back ad nauseam on him, right? Instead, it seems to me that this rethinking of military history is just a hypocritical way of still saying that war is important, but still not getting too much interested on the actual military side of it, right? There is this paradox: you study everything about warfare, except combat, right? Just a few historians began to say, you know what, but we should at least know what armies did on the field, and some of them, digress mostly on how, armies were organized, how they marched, but combat, armies are created for combat. That's their primary function. Everything from tactics to strategy gets down to fighting that freaking engagement and sending those troops into combat. You cannot be a military historian worth this name if you have studied everything about armies, but you have never studied combat, because essentially you don't even know what they're there for, right? And combat is the single most essential aspect of warfare, not just in the tactical side of the story, because people say, well, tactics is easy. Yeah, tactics is easier than strategy, but don't think that it is true up to a certain point, or better, don't think that we have sorted it out correctly throughout all the historical period, that there is not something to add, because there is a bit of a positivistic attitude in there as well. There are a few people who ever studied that, and were mostly people full of themselves, because of that reason, and no others have much discussed them. It's a fashion, right? It will change. There are deep cultural, political, social reasons for which we have abandoned the study of combat, right, including World War II. But the problem is deeper, actually, and it has to do with certain specific, also, ways of worldviews. And now let's not extend too much on which specific countries led the way, why probably they have missed some important parts. You understand how complicated it can get once you complex at least, but how many things you have to ask before even making a simple statement. I hope to finish my work in these few months to finally deliver maybe something about 14th century warfare that has not been written yet. At that point, probably will recognize me, because that's not a work that comes out very frequently, and it's actually very punching because it says something that maybe somebody doesn't want to hear, not in specific names, but in the idea that we got wrong in perspective, because we lacked exactly that, an aspect of 14th century warfare that I presume is actually very important, and it has to do with tactics and military systems. I promise I will not disappoint you. At least there is enough evidence, in my opinion, to support an important theory in that regard. So regarding to the military logic meanings, so the first one, the development of doctrine. So in defining the doctrines, the logical procedure is essential to understand, on the basis of scarce factual data, future war dynamics, right? The doctrines and tactics, in fact, depend on the theoretical evaluation that is made of the operational scenarios in which it is planned to use one's armed forces, of the best possible use of technologies, etc. This is an important topic because you know that doctrine is the body of ideas that concern war as accepted by a particular organization or military community, right? So it is literally what you, this kind of pack of notions through which you also inform your military, your armored forces, how you train them, how they're supposed to fight, and therefore it's like a leap into the future, like saying, okay, for now we go like this, and there is but of course the various military scenarios, change. Right, there is not a single army historically that has been equal to another. There's not been a single campaign in which, everything went the same way. So things change, evolve. We never talked much about doctrine, but we could expand on it, right? You know that I have actually a great interest even to talk about contemporary realities. I don't know, NATO doctrines, or I don't know, Russian doctrine. Whatever the properly the everyday life this reality is about, because how many times do we hear it talk? And it seems to me that in popular culture the military is just paraded as either for identity reasons or for showing off technology on social media, or stressing, and that's perhaps the important thing, actually, the sense of duty, of honor, of service toward the community. That is very important. It's something that we should boost more, but not just because you're a young man who wears a uniform and objectively carries out a very important duty, but because of the broader meaning that has. Right, I have found many military men, for example, ignore the concept of of Clausewitzian Trinity aside from their specifically identity sense of belonging to either a unit or for esprit de corps, or to a country, etc. It's very easy to come across veterans that have a combatantistic mindset, or that they just embrace this new theories of not really new, but unfortunate, and saying this pickable idea of warriorhood or this other bullshit that have absolutely nothing to do with what also their same military institution are actually about, historically speaking, from a civic point of view, right? Not for a warrior point of view, which is something that fortunately we left back when we evolved from warlike tribes into civilized states. That has to do with the decrease of our military capabilities, right? Largely we also wiped out from the face of the earth a lot of tribes, exactly because we were a civilized state. We had a dramatically greater military might, and but by level, right? A tribal system is military inferior to a civilized state, right? It's it's a matter of scale of inferiority and of essential inferiority, not a matter of opinion for a bunch of exalted, people that join, I don't know, maybe the military because they just want to go out kill somebody that doesn't look like them. Fortunately, our militaries, it seems to me, in the West are composed mostly by very brave, gallant, intelligent, and responsible people that absolutely know what's the military philosophy behind our military institutions and traditions, and that perform that quite honorably, and towards whom I have the utmost respect, just as towards every person that risks his life for serving the community in many ways. So I say this because as a military history-based channel, I don't want to give any impression of militarism. Militarism and pacifism are just all part of the same intellectual inferiority, even in here. If you're a militarist or a pacifist, in terms of civilization, you're a step behind, right? You are a person that probably doesn't understand what's the deal, like as far as any ism is concerned, actually. I don't make any discount, right, for anyone. I say the thing as it is, and passing to the concept of doctrine even here, we, as you understand, this concept of military logic is to do with expecting, right? It's something literally projected in the future. Like, how will our doctrine work in that context? We have to go into, right? Doctrine is made to inform a military instrument that will have to be used at some time. If anything, if you form it, you can't make it fight where you're forming it. So it's always projected in the future, no matter what situation is. So it's really making a bit of prediction, and that's why it's also very fascinating, and even more when, not just for our current future, but also in historical terms, in historical perspective, to see, how did that people fare in terms of understanding what they would have gotten into, and how were they solving problems, which is what doctrine is constantly seeking, right? These are very difficult decisional processes. They require a lot of understanding, a lot of experience, and a lot of intelligence and capacity. There are many examples of this. There are doctrines, for example, that that failed at many levels. One of the worst thing you can possibly do in military logic is stressing things like, I don't know, technologism, for example. Technologies, we've explained it many times, are just servants of doctrines and tactics, right? People believe that, I don't know, World War I was fought on the Western Front in the way it was because, machine guns, right? And if there hadn't been a machine gun, as if the machine gun, by the way, popped out magically out of nothing in the history of technology or to civilization or economy, its availability, its context, there would have been no World War I the way we know it, right? It would have been just, a matter of, one country being, less powerful than another in terms of hundreds of thousands of soldiers to simply change that balance. And the machine gun is just like, the thing on top, atop the swings of this this much larger base, like the tip of the iceberg, right? But people are obsessed with technology. They think it's all about that. There's a beautiful example also connected to World War I that we'll talk about sometime, during the Franco-Prussian War, when the mitrailleuse, that was fundamentally, it was not, in terms of specific technology of reload, an automatic weapon, but it was fundamentally the first machine gun, given the rate of fire, the range, the effective range of shooting, etc., and so on. And it was so advanced, right? It was created by the French. It was something monstrous. It had a terrific power. No other country in the world had anything like that. But they employed it during the Franco-Prussian War. It turned out that this technology was so advanced, so sophisticated, so destructive. An entire Saxon battalion, I think, at some point was literally blown in two pieces by this thing, but during the war. But for the rest, it was so advanced that it didn't find for those times standards, the military systems of that time, an adequate doctrine of application, and on the contrary, right, that its employment was not a happy one, but it contributed to the same French defeat. Right, even if it's something extremely destructive, you think, well, we've had the gun that shoots the long, the fastest and it blows up the most, then here it works, I will win. No, right, that's a pretty good example how it is not the case. If you do not have an adequate doctrine of application, it was not work. And it's not because the French didn't know how to use it, but because technically it was too far ahead in that time. In fact, do you know when the mitrailleuse was finally used to its final and pretty damn effective and deadly effect? 40 years after, during World War I. Right, the mitrailleuse had in that time the full doctrine of application, blew up Germans like crazy, right, and in that also did contribute to French victory. But this is just an example how technology without doctrine is zero, right? Doctrine is all, technology without it is zero, right? Never think that wars are won by technology. It's naive, it's silly, it's having no idea of literally what stands under the surface, right? And just concentrating on, look at how this machine works, cool, right? And it's not more manly or or competent to appreciate that the single mechanism, and to be obsessed on an engine or on a system of fire. If you don't get the doctrine, it's like you're a mechanician. You're not a military historian. The second meaning of military logic, that is the one relative to the elaboration and management of operations, is aligned with the mental processes of the command and defines them as the elaboration, in fact, and execution of a project with the unknowns normally associated with waging war. Once the objectives have been fixed, the logical military procedure defines the best ways to achieve them. And in this sense, this is still in the future, right? Just like in the first, because you're fundamentally planning what is going to happen, even if it's more imminent, even if it's more practical in a way, because the doctrine should work also in a theoretical scenario, right? When you make a plan, a briefing, you have there fundamentally what is going to happen, and doctrine is already bent to the specific circumstances because you're out of man or ammo or vehicles or whatever. You find yourself in a specific ground that is more or less difficult than the usual. So it's really something more wired to the ground literally, and that has specifically to do with the employment, in fact, of the armed forces, not much of the ideal function of them for an average standard situation, but for that specific situation. Right. If, for example, we fear that what is this logic, right? If we fear that the enemy may attack us with superior forces, right? As abstract as it sounds, it is illogical from a military point of view to stop with our army to besiege one of his strongholds, thus giving him our address and the time to reach us, right? If, on the other hand, we want battle, besieging an opponent's important strategic base can be a good way to get it. So when you study military history, as we'll see in a while now, you have to realize that this also can be properly understood. And if for you the point is just as a documentarist, as you're trained by default as a historian with no experience, to say, okay, let's just analyze this campaign, and you will focus exclusively on what the source says, which is surely what you have to start from, but then you just tell what the source says, and you don't try to imagine what could have happened in that reality. You have not carried out a military analysis. You've just told a story, right? And you may have necessarily skipped the intentions of those who were carrying out those specific strategies or tactics, so that it's not going to be of a dramatically military historical use. In fact, given the third and last meaning of military logic, to the one connected to referring to the analysis of military events, right, and what we mostly refer to in our works, this should assist or should assist, let's say, military historians, as we just said, when they have to fill in the gaps left by documentary sources. So this is also very difficult to do, right? It can be that a gap is actually very large, right? It's difficult for it to be the case the more you get naturally in documented contexts. I personally found certain gaps mostly from an intentional point of view. I mean, there were certain strategic decisions, for example, that were evidently very deliberately chosen, that, however, the sources do not say much about, and that the military logic doesn't practically, assist you even either, right? So there are literally these blank points, which even historians, the ones with good military logical understanding, say, you know what, we really don't know. And a true and honest historian should be able to say, first of all, what he does not understand, but also what, at a certain point, where we, for now at least, until someone comes up with a better idea or some other information, we do not know clearly why certain thing happened. I think this is an important. The third meaning is an important one to stop for a while, because we also, considering we talked about ancient battles on Schwerpunkt relatively often, we saw how ancient historians in particular were often actually not experts in military art, and their texts have frequently have reached us incomplete as well. So we have a double order of problems here. The first one is we these accounts were from people that were not necessarily very skilled, and that's also another thing that we'll see how to understand, and also, quite simply, unfortunately, parts of their works have been lost, right? And that's more of a philological problem sometimes, maybe, to understand. But for ancient sources, mostly everything is now more or less what remains is what we have to go with, unfortunately. Relatively to the first point, there is a tendency that I also hope I have never indulged into at certain points to think, at least from a certain point of view, and I will explain, to think that ancient sources, just because they wrote about warfare, were fundamentally competent about it, right? That's something which actually, after a while, starts sensing, at least in different ways. For example, many people think that Polybius was a military expert, because why? Because notionistically, someone comes up and waves the pages saying, because he was a commander of cavalry. He was sent as a military advisor in Ptolemaic Egypt by the Achaean League. He had to be an expert. Yes, he's surely an expert. Everything he writes about the Macedonians and the Romans must be true, right? The guy had never seen the two armies fighting against each other on the ground. And famously enough, in his histories, he draws an important military comparison between the two. If I'm not wrong, in the 7th book, I don't remember. I knew it once, but I didn't check it. But because mostly, that's, for example, a piece of information that is concluded in itself, like no other oath or fundamentally expressed itself on those grounds. That's also another thing you have to become sensitive to. I mean, to the idea that ancient historians, or anybody for that matter, writes for reasons that you may not know, right? And that's why you should know about his politics and society, because without that, you can't even understand why properly that information was deemed to be important at the time. So all these difficulties generate, for example, certain cliches or stereotypes or matters of fact, etc., that notoriously instead should be treated as very cautiously, right? Especially ancient warfare is a school of military logic. Like, in theory, I think that everything that you can learn about warfare is already present in ancient sources, right? Starting from the Bible, that is literally one of the single most important sources for ancient warfare, and with, I don't know, think about Xenophon, think about it, and not only, but also specific military, military campaigns, right, are, the massacre. I can't think of a single most complete war, didactically speaking, in history, but the Second Punic War, right? There is everything in there. You can't say, since now we know more about, I don't know, Napoleonic warfare or the Vietnam War, now we, that is, more, no, right? Everything was present there, right? This is notorious, at least where I also, just if you consider the history of tactics, think about Kanai, the meaning in the history of human civilization in general, the passage from combined arms to a synergic employment of the same. Nothing has been added, but also nothing has not been taken away from those times. You could be schooled just with that, and it's even easier because the information is less, right? It's not necessarily easy to understand. It's complex. It requires an important understanding. Like, for example, if you have no idea of ancient Greek or ancient or Latin, it's going to be very difficult to have an autonomous understanding of those realities. People say, "Oh, well, but we can't translate them because more or less we know the sense." Do you think so? Right? Do you want to do like Connolly that used the Loeb translator, and basically he invented that Carthaginians had pikemen just like Macedonians when sources actually refer to their javelins, right? It's one of those things that once again, if you just let yourself being fed by someone else, you are basically giving up your own critical skill to understand. There's no way here. It's brutal, right? I don't want to depress you. Of course, you can understand a lot of things even if you don't know Latin or other languages that of the original sources. But the point here is that we're talking about certain pieces of information that are to be found within even just the semantic meaning of I don't know, the use of a weapon, right? The long K, that is, I was saying before, the Libyan, actually Libo-Phoenician javelin / spear that was described in Greek as a long K. As a matter of fact, it's something that is to be found, I don't know, even for Hellenic marines, or sometimes even for certain longer weapon. I mean, it's very fluid, it's very flexible. If you think, for example, as a 21st century mindset, that's a categorical statement that an ancient source is describing with a word, an inflexibly encyclopedical category. There's no way to go through the thing, right? And that's important as much as understanding a campaign, right? Because it can't really mess up the same thing. And how you explain a balance on the field, that is all what the before has been about in a way or another. Coping with the lack of information is also, lack of information can be an interrupted work or a lost work, or even just an author that doesn't tell you something. And silences very often are way more important historical data than actual expressions. You can understand a lot from a mindset if you realize what they are talking about or what they are not talking about, right? That doesn't always help, of course. It would have been sometimes better if they had told us, right? But this is exactly the point. We're talking about those people. So if you're searching for what that person was, you have to accept that would have not been able to say better, or at least still the fact that they didn't say it has a meaning within itself. So you have to cope with a degree of difficulties that are not easy to all reorganize in a logical way. Right? Reconstructing the military logic of events therefore means finding a coherence where there is not always and not necessarily, and reconstructing a plot broken in several points, right? To do this, we need a thorough knowledge of the tactics and logistics of the period, just to limit ourselves to the minimum necessary, right? I can say the most banal thing ever. I mean, if you read, someone says that there was an army of 100,000 on an ancient battlefield. easily there wasn't, right? There was no way to command it for the commanding structures, the logistical possibilities of the time. And perhaps the remaining unknowns must be filled with plausible analogies, as we were saying before, based on knowledge of military art from other eras or other war cultures. This is another topic that's very dear to me. There is a bit of selection, like people, either because they have played video games too much, they maybe just know even fairly well what the warfare of a certain period was, or at least fairly well. I mean, just to know those cliches, hearsay, collected, gathered from the internet, and having created a somewhat organic understanding of it that is maybe just 60% correct, and then ignoring all the rest, right? Where those people think, I don't know, that ancient warfare is more important than medieval warfare, and who said that, and why? Where's the evidence, right? You could actually believe it's the contrary, even considering how overwhelmingly better documented medieval warfare is on ancient warfare. But this also comes from bias, progressistic, positivistic, even technologistic prejudices. I mean, the idea that the medieval times were the dark age, or they were backwards or whatever compared to the ancient, but they weren't. Notoriously, they weren't. But this is no opinion. Like, they actually weren't. Like, in terms of medieval civilization, and its acme was way more advanced than the ancient one. But aside from this, and once again, the people who disagree just look at the technology of certain specific technologies and say, look, but they didn't have this. Yeah, okay, but the others had something else, and understand why they had it. There's not a linear level of development for which you must have that specific technology in a time and in every other, so that you can't say that the ancient medieval were fundamentally the same thing, right? The Middle Ages at a certain point are more developed simply because there were more people, they were richer, and that's what starts making a greater civilization. But for most of the times, the ancient medieval times, especially considering from the Iron Age to roughly the 13th, 14th century, they were pretty much the same thing, right? There wasn't this dramatic difference, and even the loss of certain apparent loss of certain technologies is just a functional reaction to a specific context that didn't require them anymore. For example, like what you use torsion catapults for, if what you have to siege is a moat, right? It would have been stupid, but that's exactly what modern people are, to think something like that. And once again, where certain things pop out, once again, those systems, or even more effective ones, come up, and that's the proof that evidently we should be very careful about contexts and how to compare things. But don't think that the 19th century, in its worst part, because the 19th century actually produced, in my opinion, all what we should know, right? The 21st haven't produced actually anything that wasn't just a corruption of what was formulated in the history of thought of science during the 19th century. But an ugly part of it, which is also the cause of the further degeneration of intellectual capacity, is things like positivism, right? It's things like, indeed, even racism associated to it. I mean, the scale of civilizations, this other garbage and all this stuff. And yet, an overwhelming amount of people still believes in this by default, right? Not even just because they're presented consciously with the alternative, but I don't know, because they heard their parents babbling about it, and therefore they feel that's their thing, right? And that's how most, of these dynamics, unfortunately, take place. But the core idea in here of the reasoning by analogy is not like trying to fill the gaps, even in here, of single details, to say, okay, since I don't know how something mechanically worked in a certain time in history, I can't simply transpose another that I found in another era into it, right? Sometimes it works. It depends on what it is, right? But the actual importance of an analogy and comparative thinking is exactly the idea that you get the perception of the differences in dimension, right? And that's why comparing different realities far away in time with a very different degree of, I don't know, material wealth or culture and so on, is should mostly tell you how it was possible to do a thing before when there was a lack of something else, right? For the rest, the last step is very delicate, because very often the analogies can be forced and lead into error, right? It's very easy to do that, and it's even here a shortcut that usually doesn't work. But the deeper philosophy of this is that you can understand much more about, I don't know, the 30 Years' War if you have studied the Peloponnese War. You can understand much better, I don't know, the wars of Italy if you have studied World War I, and vice versa. I mean, the more you study about this whole period and of human history altogether, and the more you can properly dimension what warfare is. A person that, I don't know, is fixed on World War II and study this for a lifetime, and as I like World War II. I can say I'm obsessed about it, but it's one of those things that we largely like. It's overwhelmingly documented, close, important, and so on. But if you think that from that, I don't know, for any other war, right? If you're obsessed just about ancient warfare, and you can't have an understanding of what military history is. And you should expand on the chronological spectrum. And this is fundamental. That's also what I do on Schwerpunkt, as a matter of fact, at least from Hellenism to the Napoleonic era at this point, which feels even claustrophobic at times, because of course I would like to discuss, I don't know, World War I or even prehistorical warfare. But the concept is that the dimensions you can get in this chronological spectrum is something that you cannot get until you remain enclosed in just one of the eras. Right? Warfare changes, societies changes. Until you don't know something else, you cannot understand the value of what you know specifically. And you understand it is valid in every single situation. It's like a person that has visited just one country and thinks that that's cool just because that's their colored thing that they have collectioned, and then it thinks in relativistic terms that everything is equal to another. See the difference between a person that has traveled the world and that has also maybe studied in, country by country, a bit of the history and the culture of that country. In theory, you can have a person that has spent a lifetime traveling that doesn't absolutely understand anything, but zero about politics, society, and war. Like cheap tourism of our mass era, it's mostly about this. A lot of people taking selfies in front of a monument and not even understanding what it is, and those people will remain ignorant. That travel has, unless, just for organizational matters of the luggage or what they had to put into it, hasn't taught them anything. The thorough research for really understanding the spirit and nature, that is something that we should all recover in a way. Every day, right? It's living is not just venting your current needs or frustrations because you have to work all the time, otherwise you need to freak out in the free moment. That's unfortunate, because many people do not have many other choice, and I understand them actually, because certain realities are forced to be like that. But just the point is that very often they do not know that there is another way. They do not know that there is been a sweeter life, a more intense life, a deeper life, something that will make you live not one life but 2, 3, 4 lives. The more you know, the more you learn, right? And we waste them like this. You wonder even why values do not exist anymore, why people are turning relativistic, because they can't, or those that are strongly reactionary just cannot cope with the current reality, because in a way or another, depending on the political side of the you understand, the side of the political spectrum, they remained fixed within a narrower space from which they cannot see what's beyond, right? And this is literally what I think in the history of civilization, we think about think about the Odyssey, think about, this idea of discovering what's beyond, to take the next step, not because you have anything to earn from it, but your own realization as an individual, as a critical mind. That's something that especially I think we champion in the West traditionally, because we developed since an early time the idea that we weren't just like, subjects of a divine ruler that simply flattened everybody else, but because we thought that there was a value in that individuality, right? The moment to which we give this up, and this is happening, we are not anymore, right, what we were before. That there is a specific regression. If you want to save the West, it's not about colors. It's not about soil. It's about knowledge. It's about knowing a lot, which most of the people, both left and right, basically do not know, right? And those are not considerable as complete individuals, right? Their opinion counts less. Their importance is less as a weight in society, in politics. They are actually potentially harmful, at least more harmful than others. Right, they're a burden, and we have to fix this instead of throwing out this bullshit up. We should reform the educational system, but you come up less homework. Like, it's one of those things that you really realize that it's an old it's an old social problem. It doesn't have to do with a specific category. It has to do with the broader mindset of a people, of a culture that does exist, right, and is going downhill pretty damn fast, right, since quite a time, right, several decades at this point, and we're paying for it, right. It may be that we are enforcing certain structures that will help us to grow. I'm positive about, but still, it will not pass through the people. It will not pass through them. And if you're bothered by this, well, chances are that you should start thinking otherwise from what the general ideas of all this have been up to this point. Nobody has the courage that we have to enforce our children to absorb a ton of theory and a ton of practice to become complete individuals, and not letting them, just living in a grass like cows, right? And that's unfortunately what also many parents have absolutely no idea of, because they were grown in the same exact way. But whatever. So any possible reasoning by analogy, let's say, must always evaluate the culture, right? Not just the military of the period, before it can even be hypothesized, right? And that's where culturalists fail, because they think that the military doesn't exist as a thing in itself, but it's actually only cultural. Instead, it's the other way around, right? The military does exist, warfare does exist, violence does exist, and the way it is carried out is influenced by the background, right? But the background does not exclude the military in itself. And this distinction is very important, because nobody goes at war just for fun, right? Not even the tribal warrior lives for the lust of honor and charisma and individual pride and interest, right? That is also functional to a society in a way or another. A tribal one, but that is in its own way civilized in this sense, which is what culturalists will never accept, right? It's those people that think that von Clausewitz wrote his own work just thinking about 19th century warfare. This statement means that you have not even read the von Krieg, right? And the prejudices about this stem heavily, often from those same cultural backgrounds that talked about the new military history, right, in the last decades, are exactly the ones that mostly are soaked into this lunacy, right? And that probably caused worldwide one of the most serious losses in democratic culture and civic education in the history of mankind, right? Given the potential that we have, it's like we castrated ourselves with all the evidence and all the theory and all the backbone that we were able to produce in the last centuries. Who does read 19th century works anymore, late 18th century work? Those are gold, right? We want to feel that we are special because we do not accept that we will have to die pretty miserably pretty soon, and therefore our age must be, the thing. Unfortunately, it's not the case, right? Things come and go, right? These times are better for some things, even for lifestyle, life quality. I mean, certain levels generally of stability, but this doesn't mean that culturally speaking it follows that we have to produce who knows what, right? On the contrary, we have important problems as we have just seen, right? And also we have to be very careful at reading naturally the past through categories that are not our own, right? Even seemingly simple human feelings like fear and courage haven't always had the same meaning over the centuries, right? There are different words even just in society. Just think about, I don't know, in European culture, the difference between courage and mut, right? They come from very different backgrounds, from very different etymologies, from very different moral systems, apparently, at least, that were filtered, however, by important political and social structures that attach other meanings to them and that are expressed also by just maybe a certain part of society. If we don't dig in that background, it's very difficult for us to truly understand what these people meant, right? And this is very important because humans are completely identical, historically speaking. We do not change by the slightest from a genetical point of view from people that lived 2,000 years ago. We're the same machines. We work in the same identical way, which means that if we were projected in those times, we would be absolutely capable to adapt given certain introduction, right? Would be complicated and traumatic, but still that's what we were. So we have to make this tremendous effort of not just imagining, but properly understanding that we're limited in our knowledge of these realities, and that more than that, what we know cannot be acquired simply, right? This is one of those aspects that I often find myself in disagreement even with eminent scholars, right? It's properly this set of cliches, of phraseologies, of myths, of readjustments that are most evidently just modern political concerns to tell stories in a certain way, right? And they're not a factual, thorough, clear understanding of what it was the case like. And actually, the more you study history, the more you realize, I mean, in depth, from the sources, from really making this effort of even closing yourself for years on a certain specific reality, for really trying to understand its core, always remaining open to the rest in the meanwhile, but really making this tremendous effort of trying to arrive to the bottom sources, actually, to realize that these words were very often none of what we were told they were, right? But not just because, I don't know, one said blue or the other said red. It's because maybe it's blue, but it's blue because underneath there is something else that you haven't seen and that you didn't expect, and that actually you can sometimes even discover yourself in. Right? There are lots of things that are different in the way that they are told, but lots of other things that are saying before are fundamentally the same, or at least they correspond to the same human mechanisms. Right? And military logic is surely one of these. So many historians, would help military history lack some or all of these skills. As mentioned, for their special education, and this results in illogical reconstruction. Right? I found excellent, ancient historians, excellent antiquists, or whatever you want to call them, that, if they told you about political philosophy, they were, wow. Like, you would listen to them, like, they were so insightful and so on. They attempted to translate, to reconstruct a simple, battle, simple for, those 2 or 3 sources. That was pure fantasy, right? Of course, a person that, is better trained in one, in one field will naturally be more sensitive to, this is absolutely normal, to a similar topic, right, from his own, right? So it's the best debate actually should occur, and this is also what historians tend to avoid, also because history, fortunately, is so wide. When actually there are people who study the same thing, and there are bitter feuds about this must-telling. But we also arrive to the point which, for politeness or just quiet living, we all swim pretty far from each other. Let's say maybe in the same bay, in the same pool, but all in different sectors, so that we have a meeting ground, but at least each and everybody of us has its own field, which with history is easy to do, because there is really a lot to know. So it's objectively difficult to find people that have a similar education. Albeit there are people who are also growing, brought up, let's say, in the wake of certain thinkers. This depends also on the character, the personality. There are people who fall in love with scholars. It's something, for example, I've never done. Right, to me, what a scholar says, I respect it, I might like it. I have, of course, certain scholars that I absolutely adore, because they are wonderful to read and they taught me so much. But still, my life is, and my work are completely on my own, and I am completely on my own. And I think it's important to feel yourself completely on your own. There is, at least if you're interested in really learning how to sail alone, because university is also made of a lot of social, even political and even economical business, right? So it's obvious that there are people that want to participate because they are interested for reasons that are not strictly historical, or they want to be the guy, right? They want to be the prima donna, they want to be the scholar who is, has that suit and is regarded as such, right? I personally don't give as you understand, much about that. I just like to learn history. Like, I do all this exclusively because I like history. Like, I like to learn new stuff, and I discovered that making videos, for example, teaches me a freaking lot, right? It perfects my capacity of explaining, of reasoning. I have learned so much just from Schwerpunkt itself, and I don't know whether, hopefully you did as well, because this is also how it gets, right? At a certain point, you feel that you're lifting yourself, and at a certain point, you feel like you want to leave the nest. Sometimes I watched at certain, I followed certain figures, even on YouTube myself. I did, but at a certain point, I said, okay, well, I get what that guy's doing, right? I get what his field is. I get, and maybe I'm not interested, or at least it's insightful, but I don't have the time. You make all these economical considerations, and the ultimate goal should be to autonomize yourself, right? I'm putting out all this stuff, and I don't know, frankly, how wise this is. Like, I don't know whether this thing one day could be used against me, or I don't know. I think I say pretty orthodox things as far as at least the specific systems of references have discovered by this point. So I don't come up with dramatically new stuff. I could publish my own. I could speak of things I found out on my own, but even in there, it's nothing controversial, right? but there is still an attrition that mostly comes from the rest of society, right? I can't think of a scholar specifically could come to me and say, unless he's jealous about his own field and I say something that he doesn't like, I think that I'm arrogant. But, generally speaking, altogether what I'm doing here is evidently positive. At least someone who understands it can derive something from my work, right? I rarely get, negative feeds. I don't think that what I do is even particularly effective. This is what I point out. But there is a general advantage, let's put it in this way, in doing it, and I think it's pretty evident altogether. But certain ideas, certain core ideas, right? If you don't come on Schwerpunkt to challenge your own beliefs, or because you think you already got the thing and you have nothing else to learn, it's not because of me, but it's probably because of you, the things are not going to go well, right? Because even I think of certain aspects, right? Let's talk about battles, for example. Analyzing a battle, trying to reconstruct its course from historical accounts, often incomplete ones, we cannot fail to consider, for example, the training of the troops, both that relating to their type and to that found in the period considered, right? This is a passage, for example, that I don't know how often it's done, right? I rarely read a book, right? Even in a battle analysis, often, it takes really a line or some words to say, okay, we know that these troops, for example, were not dramatically trained, right? Why? Because that back home, like their society, their didn't allow them, or we simply have no evidence, or at least even for their weapons, we know that there is a certain level of training attached to their employment, or from the same performance, right? So that in general, we cannot attribute complex maneuvers to poorly trained troops. While if we assume that a commander ordered a particularly risky maneuver to troops with low morale, for example, a fake rout, we should also add that it was a reckless and dangerous decision, and the commander in question is great, right? There is in there a challenge to yourself, that is, what do you think is right? You or the people who wrote, right? Sometimes, maybe before we had also to digress in another aspect, that is, the military competence is not always military logic, right? When, for example, ancient historians wrote about a certain reality, they might have not been military expert themselves, but they might have gotten military logic better than us, in the sense that even if they maybe fabricated a battle account that never existed, or at least that didn't go that way, still there was a logic that maybe they took from other people. Like, for example, banally, even Polybius, we mentioned before. I mean, we have literally no idea which sources he used, right? Especially, with whom had he talked, that had fought somewhere in these great battles. We do not know. We'll never know. But I presume that a person, belonging to a political and social elite, also having some military task, would, generally speaking, be acquainted in a world that fundamentally revolved almost exclusively around warfare as a general aim and ambition, and promise even, had pretty clear that, I don't know, there couldn't be flying elephants on a battlefield. But not be, now I use the hyperbole, but the idea is that by studying, for example, the battle accounts of ancient sources, you realize that, especially in certain periods, I don't know, the Hellenistic time, there was a shared narrative of what a battle was, that is concretely works also in terms of broader military logic with the other eras, so that person might have not been particularly competent, but at least knew what it was talking about. If you get to late Roman times, I don't know, where historians became just rhetoricians of court, and were also had a very particular education and so on, very narrow. at some levels and starting to discuss, events that took place a half of a millennium before. Well, at that point, you see actually that the realism of those description is becoming lower. There are strange things happening on the battlefield, or strange even just numbers or figures on the fields, or certain curiosities more than reconstructions, right? So in there you see even, for example, the changing of a thought, of a literary tradition, of a mindset, and that equally tells you that not necessarily what was being written there reflected, for example, the contemporary warfare of the time, nor that military logic had sunk, broadly meant, but just maybe a certain part of society was not so used to be involved into it than it was before. This is typical, actually, of many contexts, especially when the middle classes decline, when there is more, less freedom of thought, after all, with the hierarchization, monarchization of society, and so on. And this thing of the training, for example, I discovered just talking on Schwerpunkt that many people do not get it. Right, I remember that video on Gallic warfare. That was that guy. I had to tell at all costs that since I don't know that there were certain Gallic warriors who made stunts on horseback, that equated to the fact that Gallic cavalry is strong. I mean, how do you even the concept of collective or individual training? Where do you place it? Right, if you've never heard of it, and you just think that it takes to make evolutions on horseback, to have a strong cavalry, I think you have missed basically the whole military institution of the time, and that's a serious problem, right? Because it means that in turn you ignore political background, social background, the whole history of warfare in its development and evolution. What are we talking about? Do you think this is like a video game where you just implement a single guide that eventually that makes how armies actually and units operate on the field, and with which constants or resilience or order that they can work, right? How do you think warfare actually is based on? It's based on guys that make stunts, or on rigid collective training with an intensive, process that goes on for sometimes even for years under a specific institution that is able to deliver that specific training that others do not have, simply because they're politically fragmented. They don't get it, and they have to recur to individual feats to try to cope, to put up with military systems that are, because they're collectively way more trained, that they dramatically more advanced, and in fact wipe them out quite easily, right? So it's all a circle, right? Logic is a circle. You can't escape that, right? Nobody's going to take you seriously if you do not applicate that specific logic. Still on the subject of maneuvers, for example, if we hypothesize a complicated one, we should also explain in detail what tactical actions it consists of, when and if it was tested in training, what precedents there are of that maneuver, how long it could take to complete it, and so on, right? How, for example, a person can understand what the Manipular Legion was fundamentally about in its genesis, in its development, in its maturity. If one skips, such a banal thing, was just a maniple trained to perform throughout the various ages, to perform a flanking maneuver, right? If a person just thinks it was a standard thing, it means he hasn't studied Scipio's Spanish and African campaigns, because that's the whole deal, notoriously about the thing. Especially about ancient warfare, it's so easy to spot who doesn't know the thing, right? Because there is just that thing. So if you miss it, it's because you skipped it. If you skipped it, it's because you have never studied the sources. It's that easy. But even just this thing of maneuvering, of collective training, it's basically the single most important topic in the whole history of warfare, at least as far as tactics are concerned, right? If you don't get that, it's useless. It's all over. right? You can't appreciate what Alexander's army was, what Rome's manipulator system was, what Hannibal's tactics were, what place they have in the history of warfare. It's over. It's over. There is no depth. There is no perspective. There is no intelligence. It also, you can't invent logical connections, right? It seems banal, like I'm doing to sophisticated stuff, thinking, just maneuvers and so on that are sophisticated in as much it's basically one of the highest point of strictly military talk about ancient history. But here military logic also does not escape basic logic, right? It's something that the cause-effect relation. It's literally the first and single most important. It's like the myelinic cover of and the nerves. Like if you skip that passage, you don't get anything. You cannot say that since there was one thing and another, the two things are connected if you do not prove that connection. This is basic logic, right? You can't say, I feel today that since one people fought against one other, they took the thing from that people. That's aside from the fact it's a mechanistic and technologistic, obsession of 21st century mindset that is easily spottable. But the question is, where's the proof? Because they fought and then they were like, and where's the proof? And where's the inner mechanism of a people absorbing another military feature if you do not explain why politically and socially that system ought to have taken that specific feature, and how could it make it work, especially, right? If it didn't have any pregressed notion of that or any fertile ground. Remember the doctrine of employment of specific technology, right? Here we are at the ABC of history, right? And sadly enough, it's very rare to find anyone who even pose itself the problem. So I make these videos to terrorize you a little bit, or at least those who know these things will be actually proud to be among the group that can make it on its own, and because they already know it, right? I don't need to recall them, but the others should make very honest inquiry on themselves and say what they have become up to this day is actually sufficient, or do I get immediately? And I can't tell you because I always gotten it, and I can get it even now regarding to things that I do not know for sure, but that I have intensified in sensitivity. In fact, that sense of, I know I'm tricking it. I know I'm doing it for ideological reasons. I know I'm doing it because I just want, to be right. Or I know I'm doing it because I just want to show off. Or because I think this guy may not know. Well, the sad thing is that people that do not know things do not know that the things that exist can be known by other people. And that's why they're so easy to spot. And especially why they're so difficult to convince, because they do not know the thing, and if they haven't not known it autonomously, and maybe you just present the correction of it at the moment, they will not accept it, because they are hurting their ego, and they cannot be responsive to that. But then maybe after 1 year, 2 years, you find the same person is actually repeating what you stated, and you understand that maybe that worked, right? Also consider that there can't be a growth, right? A development, a maturity without contrast, without confrontation, right? We grow. I know it's unpleasant sometimes, most of the times, but we gotta admit we kind of like them, right? It's that kind of competition and and conflict that we inherently find in the same world we are trying to study. Right, it's war in its own kind in some way. Speaking is like fighting a battle in a way. So, just to conclude the concept of maneuver, right? Consider also what these men were, right? What these armed men were. You don't turn a militia into something that can perform, I don't know, an enveloping maneuver without previous training or specific equipment at certain point, hold the line for some longer time. You can have a cavalry that charges more than a certain amount of time if it's not properly trained, right? Those are also the indicators through which, conversely, you can measure the actual quality of those units, which is also what militarily logically is there, right? That's where you can evaluate the military quality, the military average of a people, of a unit, right? Not whether you like that people or you like that unit because you decided that you have to make propaganda for it. The first is a logical thinking. The second is hubris, right? It's literally abandoning the rationale because you just think you can't go without that, and you're gonna crush your face somewhere, right? It's easy as that. So in order also to have a militarily logical reconstruction, the result must be free of internal contradictions. Other banal aspect, you can't. Sometimes you make all a research and inquiry, and you in a reconstruction, and you're proud of it, and you think it works, right? Maybe you genuinely think it does. Then somebody criticizes it, and you say, "Oh wow, no, I made all of this work now. I don't want to correct it. The person who knows what it thinks it be. I made the work. This person knows nothing. I'm the best, right?" And then you read the thing and you say, "Wait a minute, but this person." It's important also to be understood by others, right? It's you can't just speak your own language and pretending the others to understand you if you don't explain yourself logically, right? And rationally, hopefully. So maybe if you reread because there is a bit of perspectival distortion. You are sometimes so fixated one thing for a long time that you need. It's very useful also when you write a work to take the distances a little bit for 3 or 4 days to free your mind from that cage and then to come back and to reread everything as if you read it for the first time. And that's very useful because that's where you spot something that doesn't work. And maybe at the time you were trying to make that phrase work and trying to put it together to make sense, but it's too artificial. There was something you were skipping that you didn't think enough. Maybe in these days you have been rethinking the thing unconsciously, and then you reread the thing, and the right phrase comes immediately because you have enough understanding at that point. You're fresh enough to come up with something important, right? The thing must really be fluid. It must be understood. It must also be simple, right? Too complicated things in warfare do not work. There is a principle of simplicity in the ones of traditional, let's say the traditional ones usually associated to war. One is simplicity, right? One is simplicity. You cannot think that, military speaking, too many complex things happen because the system is so under so much stress and complications that the easiest it is, and very often the best it works, right? Within also the limit of the chances you have to take and the diversification within it. But usually warfare happens very simply. There is no need to recur to complicated explanation. If you think that the explanation is too sophisticated or elaborate, just think that, or even if you think it is because you want it to be like that, just check it double time, because it will probably tell you that there is no need to bring on the fore certain concept just to explain the thing in sophisticated terms. Things might have gone way more simply than you imagine, right? And a very important aspect of that evaluation of maneuvers, of the quality of the troops, passes exactly through these forms of reconstructions. I mean, if you know that something can be explained in simpler terms and you don't find any convincing reason for which the thing might have gone otherwise on the base of evidence, just reduce it to a base and then maybe make an hypothesis saying, well, it might be possible at some point that, that unit even went that far as performing a certain task, but, it's just an hypothesis, because if you don't see it, it's probably not there, because historically it's at least you can't say it if not making it an hypothesis. So military logic, as you understand, is something that presupposes but also adds to normal logic from Aristotle down, right? It doesn't replace it, but it integrates it, right? Logic is there, rationality is there. In our own understanding, you do not need to reinvent logic, but just know that certain environments are provided with a not much with a logic on its own, but with certain dynamics that make it look as such, right? As we were saying before, logic is simple. It's the word to be complicated. So everything declines itself in the way it happens to be because of the very complex nature of our own experience, but at the same time, it doesn't, substitute normal logic because, you feel that it should, right? Military history is not one of those subjects where everybody can come up with its own thing, and the more it's original, the more it works, or the more it imports a logic of a certain kind, it has to forcefully fit in the military one. There are usually, at least as I see, there are people who like to, to discuss, for example, certain aspects of warfare, pointing out single factors. For example, even here, for example, we didn't bring forward the concept of decisiveness, right, of a certain factor, which is another problem people usually have to explain with one absolute thing, that the wall, right? Warfare teaches us constantly that it's not the case, and then we're lucky if we can even see what was the most important factor in relative terms. That doesn't make it even absolute for that matter. And it's mostly a complex of factors that, as long as you can reconstruct on the base of evidence, okay, you add to it. But finding specifically the cause-effect connections is wholly another thing, and we do not exercise much our kids to reason like that, right? One thing is we often encourage them, even I see schools do it, to have their own opinion, to form their own opinion, but there can't be just that. You also have to tell them that, unfortunately, any opinion is either better or worse than another one. There is no two equal things. You cannot present them with a relativistic moral system for which all what it matters is to open mouth and say whatever it crosses your mind, right? Because you should be absolutely free to do it, but this has nothing to do with you always saying something meaningful or important or intelligent or valuable that can serve someone, right? And unfortunately, for doing that, which is what at the end of the day creates less noise and more benefit is applicating yourself a lot and testing your opinion, your hypothesis in reality. And warfare gives you, in this sense, an enormous playing ground, because it's so based. You can really check everything you want in a way, and the most beautiful thing is it's actually to learn from it, not arriving there thinking you can add who knows what, but simply let's take a look, already to 10 battles altogether and see what you can learn from them. Right, and you will discover a world out there that maybe you didn't even know that it existed, and that's how it starts. That's how it gets in motion. How military logic emerges almost on its own at the end of the day. So, really, let's practice in this sense. And with these videos, I just, as you understand, try to invite people to do it, right? I don't tell them how to. I mean, I can't tell you maybe how it happened for me, what is that I still, that I miss, of course, that I'm more or less capable in, or more or less expert on. We can't share this kind of it, but it should be aimed at an autonomous understanding, autonomous learning, right? And too often, we have to realize that logical or rational background is not there. As I was saying also in those videos, we're talking about the issues of civilization, of properly what it means to be civilized. Well, it does pass through this, and do not think that our world is that civilized, in the sense, at least, even here, not sounding relativistic in turn, I do presume that really the Western world brought, earlier than others, such thoughts on the fore. This is not my opinion. I mean, it's something you can follow actually from the history of, from historiography in itself, for example. As we often said, it's not that that China ever had a Thucydides or a Xenophon, right? We began to, or not that even at that time, at the time of Thucydides or Xenophon, the Scythians or the Iberians had the same thing, right? But the thing spread mostly in the wake of Western, culture, education, its structures, hierarchy, and so on. So the thing was eventually at the base, famously enough, of our. So there is a specific, lighthouse to orientate yourself on these issues. There is no, every culture is the same. No. Unfortunately not, right? Cultures, I presume they cannot be compared, because a culture is the product of a context that you should first of all understand, right? Civilization is, right? Even if you're not interested in making a chart of like a result of all the various classifications and to compare, but properly, right? The more you're civilized, it means the more you're rational. The more you have abandoned a primitive state of, dominated by spirits, by, strange forces you cannot understand, it, you have to make up for it in essentially an emotionalistic way, right? And the more you're able to fix problems concretely. And that's why also I, from a certain time onwards, but maybe not in the recent days, but a bit before, last month mostly, I addressed this issue when talking, for example, the difference between a citizen soldier and a warrior. Well, many Westerners still do not understand the difference. They think they can switch the thing or overlapping them. Well, they're two concretely different things. And if you look at our past, you also have to be prepared to make distinctions in that ground, and not, just backing one side because you think that you're somewhat connected to it, so you want to make it look more special than really it was, right? We have to be honest, because we have those objective parameters that cannot be put into discussion, and I see it. Most Westerners have absolutely no idea of what these parameters are. They do not know history enough. They do not know politics enough in the way they should. Right, it's not the stories, the conspiracy theories, the extremism. It's about sound logic and rationality, which is a very rare good. Right, it's this video, as you know, could go on forever, because there are so many examples we could throw in. But for now, I think we can't stop it here. Just make an exercise that if you really want to, which also teaches you how to look at geography with different eyes sometimes. try to exemplify a logical military reasoning by trying to identify the place of a battle about which we know more or less just the place where it happened by the name of the toponyms in the sources, but that we do not know where they physically took place. Try to even just to adapt yourself to the concept of, I don't know, an army had a certain size, a certain space to calculate these things. Do not fall into wargameism thinking that we're just fixed, at distances or, spaces or formations, etc. Just be, adaptive in that kind. But look at a map. Take an altimetric filter on Google Maps. Look at how the ground is, and think of how if you had to fight in there, what would be the best choice given your strategic and tactical needs at once, right? I know that I ask sometimes even another thing, believe it or not, but tactics and strategy sometimes are confused by people. I don't know why. I think it's one of the easiest thing in the world to understand, but still, if you really want to fix that, start from these exercises. I don't know, maybe one day we will even come up with certain games, because those are useful and they have properly they show you very punchingly what military logic really is, right? And you would be surprised by how much one can learn in those terms. But specifically, be curious. Do not stop. Do not ever think that you're not worth it, or it's too difficult. We all start in the same way, right? The only difference is made by how much passion and effort and honesty you put in it, and that's you. That's not someone else. That's why I say do not follow blindly what other people tell you. Do not take everything for granted for the positive and negative sense. Be always yourself, even in mistakes, because that will teach you how to take responsibility and to do better, right? And we all pass through it, and actually some have it easier because maybe we get to study things because we have more time or money or whatever, but that cannot compensate for people who really sweat and cry hard for it, because those are the people that learn more, right? Those are the people who have a truer commitment, that are forged through that effort, especially at a young age. That is very, very important. Just do it, right? Especially if you're still very young, like if you're a teenager especially, it's the best thing if you really want to get into this craziness of military history. It doesn't pay you much, I can tell you. It doesn't, most people do not care, but if you really feel the passion, if you're a teenager, start that age, because that is, I don't know what I would have given to at least start to study these things seriously at that age, right? I came later, relatively later, but it's enough, right? Just a few years of distance can really make a big difference. And continue as much as you can, especially read as much as you can up to 24 years old. Like between 11 and 24, your brain is like a sponge that, in terms of intellectual growth, is capable of achieving feats that if we only intensively train all our youth to do, we would have generations of geniuses, right? Never give up. Never think that reading is useless. Never think it's just adult talk for making you stay in line. It's really power. It's really as if you had a gun, right? And I'm not kidding. It's something extremely powerful and extremely tough to handle. That's what will make you an adult faster and better, right? So please be it. And also, if whatever age, it's never too late, right? It's never too late for anyone, right? And also people, it happens, up to very few generations ago, but many people couldn't read or write properly, right? But if you give if you make them believe in themselves, if you tell them that everybody can make, and if you really want to explain, and that's where logic really works, not just in warfare, but in all studies, make them understand why it is important, why all the beauties that you can have, what you can picture through history. Just think about, what it means to know how to what it means to learn how to write a word. That you can write sea or tree or mountain, and every time you write that, you have that beautiful vision, and it becomes yours because you know how to express it in this way, and you can compose this all together. Think about how much history can give you to compose all together, and how much beauty, and how much understanding and true happiness, I presume, in a measure that can give you, right? I think that's the real thing. I think that's why we are insisting so much for learning, because it's a real way of living better. It's not a joke. It's not a delusion. It's real. It works for real, right? Okay, so for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.